Okay, so I'm pleased to have Hugues Bersini coming here as a guest. So Hugues is a computer scientist, but he's used to work with lots of people from lots of disciplines, from biology, chemists, or engineers, etc. And actually, I've been working with Hugues from, I think, the middle of my PhD. In fact, it's been from a long time. And what he will talk to us is a very general presentation of networks and the application of the networks to lots of fields. So,
thank you, Raphael. So, pleased to see you all here. So, as Raphael said, I'm basically an engineer, and I'm teaching. I'm working at the University in Brussels. So this is, in fact, you've seen 3 little images here, and they're all important. This is some, you should recognize that one. This is some very famous monument in my city. So this is where I'm from, Brussels, and this is a very small example of network. This famous atomium, which is not at all a network, which is an iron structure. Crystal, but whatever. But I make it as a network, and this will be half of my talk. Will discuss about this apparently new science of networks, and because it's pretending there's some new things going on in science of networks. And one of the things is that networks are dynamics. So there are new nodes coming in time, and nodes disappearing in time, and nodes are changing in time too. So not only the state of the node are changing, but also the structure of the network, which is what people call the new science of networks. In fact, I illustrate that by this kind of dynamic atomium. And so I'm working in a lab. I'm heading this lab, by the way. The lab is called Iridia, and it's a computer science lab. In fact, I'm teaching computer science in my university for 20 years, so I'm teaching to graduate students how to program and this kind of stuff. But I'm also heading a lab, which is an artificial intelligence lab, which is an old lab, which is 25 years old lab, which is with something like 50 researchers working in this lab. In fact, Raphael know the lab because they visited us and stayed with us some years. And in this lab, there was a lot of different people doing different things, like I guess certainly in that place also, as I may have guessed, discussing a little bit with Raphael about this place. But since I don't know you at all, and I know that you're strong theoretical physicists, I don't want to, I'm going to cover a lot of different topics. I think it's better like that. It's sunny outside, and I want to make it light, relaxing, and I'm going to say different things about different topics that we're covering in my lab. So obviously, I prefer to make it shallow and large instead of, focusing, just because I don't know what is your interest. So just please, let's make it, Axel asked me that, we can make it like that. Just make it as interactive as possible. And so since I'm going to cover different topics, so if there is something that you like more than something else, just interrupt me. And if you want to be more focusing on that thing, I'd be very delighted to do so. I will not pretend to do that from first place. I would pretend more to cover different things that we're doing in my lab. Since it is an engineering lab, it might be not exactly the same perspective as your perspective, which is, I think, more theoretical physics. But anyway, if you are interested in anything, I would stop on that. So I would cover, this is a little book that I've written in French. I just put it here because the title of the book was Networks and Sciences. And one of the good things of networks is that this seems to be another kind of very universal topic, which cover very different disciplines. You heard about networks in sociology, you heard about networks in computer science, obviously. You heard about networks in biology, and this is one of the most active fields in physics. You might know that one of the most quoted papers of physics these last 20 years is indeed the paper of Barabasi, who wrote recently, some years ago, a paper called "This New Science of Networks." And it's a physicist, so there's a huge community of physicists now working on these scale-free networks. I think it's even one of the 5 highest quoted papers in physics of this last 20 years. So just to tell you that network seems to be a very hot topic in physics too. And the networks is not at all new for me. because I'm working in network for more than 20 years, and this is the last picture, which is in fact my intellectual guru. Anyone has his own guru, and I have mine. He was a biologist. He died some years ago, and his name is Francisco Varela. He's a Chilean biologist, and I will explain you why this was my guru, because we worked on network exactly 20 years, 25 years ago. When I did my PhD, I did my PhD with him on immune network. This is one of the things I'm going to cover, and you'll see that 25 years ago we were doing exactly the same thing. That what is becoming more, again, interested for some years due to the works of Barabasi. So what I'm going to do is split my talk in two parts of equal length. One will be more covering what we're doing in my lab, just to give you an idea of what is my interest. And you'll see that they are pretty broad. I prefer to cover, since I have a lot of good researchers in my life, I prefer to accompany them and do interesting researches with them. And I'll cover different things that we're doing in my lab, which I call the bio and emergent computation. And that will be a broad and shallow overview of what we're doing in my lab. For half of my talk, I'm supposed to speak 1 hour. Is that okay? Or a little bit less? Up to you. But if you want less, you just cut me. If you want more, just tell me. And I can just adapt myself to whatever you want. And then the second half of the talk will be much more focused on network and what is this new science of network. What are those key properties that people are looking in network, and seems to discover those properties in different places of science, physics, biology, sociology, or whatever. And I will conclude on the main application that, since I'm an engineer, I'm interested in applications. So what are the main applications that those networks can drive to? So bio and emergent computation. So this is different things that we are doing in my lab. For instance, this is an interesting story that we're doing in my lab. For instance, we are working together with ethologists, people interested in ants, and we're simulating those ants. This is a very interesting experiment that people know quite well in the ants world, which is, how ants collectively find shortest path. You have two paths, and a colony of ants will rapidly focus and converge to the shortest one. And that is easy to explain, easy to simulate. But since we are engineers, some of the things we do is trying to be inspired by that to build tools. And I'll show you the kind of tool that we can build out of it. So you see, this is thing that we're doing now. Second thing is that we're doing robots in my lab. And we're doing a lot of things with robots. But one of the things that interests us with robots is to have a lot of small robots, a little bit like ants, very stupid robots, very simple one. When they're isolated, when they're single, they can't do anything interesting. But once they want to do something interesting, for instance, just not falling in that gap, passing over a gap, or just carrying an object which might be too heavy for only one robot, they decide to join together, exactly like simple insects. So they join together, and collectively they achieve interesting tasks. So we have different experiments that we're doing in the lab with those robots. We're building networks, but one of the things that engineers are interested in network, this is a neural network that maybe some of you might recognize. This is a classical feed-forward neural networks. And this is giving rise to a new kind of engineering, where for instance, one of the first things this neural network was able to do, one very interesting thing, it was the first autonomous driver. When the first car that has been driven on a motorway without driver was driven by a neural network. And it's interesting to know how people achieve that. If you want to know the story, I participated to that story some 20 years ago. But that, those network science gave also, rise to a new kind of engineering. No one tried to really understand how that network drive the car, but it could drive the car. At the time, it was 20 years ago. It was able to drive the car just by replicating the human driver, but without understanding it, just replicating, just copying it. So other thing that we're doing, since we're computer scientists, we'd like to simulate things, and this is, in fact, the work done by Varela 25 years ago. He was working on the origin of life, and he has a theory, which is famous, in biology, which is called the autopoietic theory, which is the theory of Varela. And we're building simulation of minimal cell, with a membrane, with a little metabolism, and we try to have the simplest computational experiment that would be able to replicate to some extent what we know about cells, etc., etc. And also we do some computer experiment on this big layer membrane, etc. Because we're computer scientists, my vision of computer science is that computer science should help society, should help engineers, but should help also biologists and chemical scientists to understand better the object of interest. And in fact, this gives rise to, I will just make a little parenthesis of a certain new form of what people call emergent computation. Emergent is a famous term. There's another famous one. You have network, which is a famous one, and emergence is another famous one. This is one of my term that I like a lot because it's completely ambiguous, completely controversial. No one understands the same thing by this term. There's this famous expression that no one understands in the same way, which is the whole is more than the sum of its parts. You know, this is an interesting expression, and I've organized myself a lot of philosophical debate, philosophical, meeting. One of it, I did it in Erice, maybe some theoretical physicists know that place. I organized in Erice last year a huge meeting on emergence. Laughlin was there, this physicist. It was where Anderson, there's a lot of brilliant people, we were 100, and we discussed about our definition of emergence, and no one agreed. No one agreed what is the whole, what is the part. I have my own vision of it, As a computer scientist, it makes things very clear. I don't think there's a lot of emergence in nature. The only emergence I would like to bite to is in biology. Everyone agrees that, in emergence you have two levels of vision. You have this micro one. In fact, when I want to describe emergence to my student, I say, you have two kind of, scientists. You have the MIG-Jim. I call MIG-Jim the micro scientist, the one who knows the parts. And you have MAG-Jim. MAG-Jim is looking the set of things. He has a global vision, and he can integrate things in space and time, like when you do cellular automata, you can have a global vision because you see everything on the computer screen. But MIG-Jim knows exactly the rules of the cellular automata. So the problem is how to reconcile who knows the truth, MIG-Jim or MAG-Jim. And now you can carry on, and that makes it more interesting than just the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So I give in general example. The end is one of my favorite ones. It's the one that people know the best because you know exactly the rules that the ants are following. You know what the ants are doing, they just deposit the pheromone. And whenever you have a bifurcation, an ants will just follow the path which smells the most, And you can easily show that if the ants are doing the way both sides, this is for instance, the nest, and this is the target, and the ants are just, going back and forth. It is so easy to understand why slowly, gradually, but certainly, the path which is the shortest will have the most of this pheromone. And at the end, all the ants, this is a positive feedback mechanism, all the ants will converge towards the shortest path. People call that emergent, but we know exactly the rules that are followed by the ants, so the parts are pretty well known. But it's true that if you're an engineer and you look at that and you say, oh, look at that. Interesting, because collectively the ants can achieve the shortest path. So this is another example of emergence. In neural network, you have exactly the same thing. You have neural network. Any neuron are doing very simple things. This is a Hopfield network. Hopfield is a famous physicist that, worked on Hopfield network, and they explain how a neural network can code a memory. Can be used as an associative memory. Every neuron is doing a very simple thing, just receiving the signal, and it's a threshold thing, when it has enough of the signal, you just leave the signal pass away. And you can explain how these things have fixed point attractor, and if you put memory in each of these fixed point attractor, like you try the neural network to encode an 8, just the number 8, any neuron will be 1 pixel, and the neuron collectively can achieve a certain associative memory. This, again, could be called emergent, because the 8 is nowhere in the neuron. You just observe the neural network and you see the number 8. So is that emergent? I don't know. Whatever I can tell you is that we have huge debate about it. My definition of emergent is that there is one emergence. At least the strongest one I know is in biology. You know why? Because in biology, there's an interesting fact. You also have the parts interacting among themselves. But also what is interesting in biology is that you need to have an observer, and you need to have these things emerge for something. For instance, in biology, something that you don't have in physics is that you have natural selection. Any biological phenomena, any collective biological phenomena has to have some kind of purpose and have to have some kind of natural selection acting in. And for instance, I discussed many times with physicists the study of birds, this collective flying birds. When a physicist study birds, he study birds and he tried to figure out the parameters that just replicate the flying of the collective flying of the birds. But what a physicist will never do is to explain why these parameters are just that ones, why those values are. And the only way you can explain the value of the parameter of the birds is if you add an actor, which is why the bird is flying this way. And why the bird is flying this way is because of natural selection. And so I think that emergent is physics. This is my definition. Now, you can disagree on that. As I told you, we had people disagreeing on that. But my definition of emergence is the only possible emergence in biology, and emergence is physics plus natural selection. And this is why I was interested in emergent. Okay? So if you disagree, cut me. This was just a philosophical parenthesis. I will tell you more useful thing later on, yeah?
You mentioned also the robots, which did collective behavior, and there you would know, of course, in detail what they do. Is that really local interactions in those cases?
They're completely local interacting. The robots just see each other. They have no global vision. The robots are as simple as insects. And in fact, you know, why do the robots connect? They connect because there is a gap. Mm-hmm. And they connect because they don't want to die. Obviously, they're robots, so robots don't really die. But we, you know, interesting enough, you know, the robots are just evolving exactly. We do the robot in simulation, and we make them evolving exactly like the real insects. So the way we find the right rules of a robot is just by natural selection. Mm-hmm. So we just play the Darwinian game for the robots. So in fact, I tell that the robots have emergent behavior because they decide to collect together. Together they achieve things that is useful for the colony. Mm-hmm. So this is emergent. Mm-hmm. That was my definition of emergence. So more practically, why are we engineering? You know, we engineer. So for instance, this ant colony thing. You know, we build an algorithm, which is the most famous algorithm today for routing the packet on internet. It's called the ant colony optimization. If you go on the web and you Google on ACO, ant colony optimization, you'll see that this algorithm is becoming very famous. It's the fastest router on the internet, and it's ant colony optimization. So it has been inspired by ant. Exactly, this algorithm works exactly like ant. You know, you have the packet, you know, the packet routing on the internet, they just leave a pheromone, not the real pheromone, it's just a like pheromone. And every other packet is just taking its route, following, you know, the path of the internet with the largest path of pheromone. This is the fastest and the best optimization algorithm. You see how biology can inspire engineering, and it's called a ant colony optimization. Another thing that we're doing in the lab is working on neural network. But we're not, you know, one of the things that happened with neural networks is that Hopfield was a very good physicist back to the 80s, and he studied neural networks. And he was interested in his understanding how a neural network, you know, a neural network is inspired by the brain, how a neural network can encode information. And what these physicists proposed back to the 80s was to say, it's simple. In fact, like in a slide I just showed before, we will put information in fixed points. Okay? Whenever you have a fixed point, we'll put information. And you have an interesting emergent property. One of those is robustness. You know, if you live with the initial condition, which is just that fixed point a little bit noisy, the network just by itself naturally will converge towards the fixed point. This is why it's called associative memory, because you can, you know, you just remember part of the face, just the nose and the eyes, not the rest of the face, and the network will fill it up the image, you know, just simply. You know. But the problem is that the brain, you can look at the electroencephalogram and you've never seen a fixed point in the brain. The brain is one of the most chaotic machines that you can imagine if you just look at the oscillation in the brain. In fact, if you look at the brain, this is the kind of signals you can see. So what we're doing in my lab is trying to see if you relax the fixed point hypothesis, if you're supposed to play with other kind of attractors, like cyclic attractors and chaotic attractors, what kind of information processing this is. And so we're showing in my lab that if you relax this fixed point and you play with attractors which are oscillatory, which are much more reminiscent of what is happening in the real brain, you explode the information capacity of the brain. The brain becomes much more capable of storing information than just with fixed points. This is another thing that we're doing in the lab. Last topic, you know, this is all things inspired by biology, the ant, brain, and now the last topic is the immune system. And then one of the things, this is where I came to networks. In fact, I came to networks by Varela and another famous, in fact, he's Danish, a famous Nobel Prize of Medicine called Niels Jern, who received the Nobel Prize of Medicine in '84. Now, he didn't get the Nobel Prize of Medicine by this theory, but he was also the author of a theory called the network theory of the immune system. And that is a fascinating theory. But the immunologists are still a little bit controversial with this theory, but it's a fascinating one. And just in 2 minutes, I will tell you this theory. Normally, people understand immunology like that. Simple thing. I want to be rough, and excuse me if you know more immunology than what I'm telling you. You know, you have an immune system that doesn't do anything, except when a virus or an antigen, this is the way the immunologists call it, an antigens get in. So when an antigen get in, here, this is the bad guy. What happens is that the antibodies recognize it. This is the good guys, okay? The antibody just recognizes the antigen. Once they have recognized the antigens, what happens is recognition process activate the proliferation of the B lymphocyte. The B lymphocyte, they do produce the antibodies, okay, and they do produce themselves. They clone much more faster, okay. This is called the first response of the immune system. Then the bad guy is just killed, by the system. Once the bad guys, come back again, the system is much more ready. And this is the second response of the immune system. Okay, this is the classical theory of immunology. This is why you've been vaccinated, just to activate the first response. And then, no, what happened is that Niels Jern, in '84, discovered something that was very fascinating for the people. This is shown in this slide. Is that the antigen activate the antibody, but the antibody among themselves, they do activate them. They recognize them. An antibody behaves against another antibody exactly like an antigen. Niels Jern made that experiment possible. He put an antibody, and he saw that the other antibody was responding to that antibody. That was called the network theory of immune system. But that was a shocking theory for immunologists, because that was violating a principle which is, this is the Bible of immunology. If you open any kind of immunological book that you open, you'll see that the first page is that the immunologist, what the immune system is good for, is to recognize self from non-self. No one has ever raised what is self and non-self, but at least you know that it's recognizing and it's distinguishing self from non-self. But if you suppose that the antibodies recognize themselves, exactly like they would recognize an antigen, who is self and who is non-self? That was very shocking for the immunologists at the time. And I worked with Varela, so 35 years ago. I worked on network, and we were trying to understand what this network theory could bring, could learn to immunologists. Yeah, please.
What does this recognize mean? In the sense that they recognize and
they bind. So it's a protein binding.
In the same way as they would to an antigen?
Exactly. So in fact, this is just protein binding. So when an antibody recognizes an antigen, this is just a kind of physical binding. Okay, they're just shaping. It's a little bit more complicated than just physical binding, because you have van der Waals electrical forces, you have different things. But at the end, it's a binding. It's really, this is what people call recognition in immunology, just binding. And they do bind among themselves. So antibodies form complexes.
What are the consequences of binding? Is it to neutralize something or to enhance something?
So what is the consequence? So I have to go a little bit more in detail. So what's happened when an antigen is being bound by antibodies, there is different consequences. One of the first consequences is then the macrophages, which is the real one that was going to kill the antigen, they kill the whole complex. So they only see the antigen when it's being bound by the antibody. It's just a way of attracting the guy that's going to destroy everything. The other consequences is that once the antibodies bind the antigens, there is a system of amplification that people don't really understand how it works. But there is an amplification of the production of both antibodies. The one that binds. Any B cell here produces only one kind of antibody. So any B cell has on its shape, has its surface, it produces one kind of antibody. And once this antibody recognizes an antigen, for a mechanism that is still not completely understood, this B cell will produce much more of its antigens, and the immunologists call it activate. It becomes activated just by this recognition of binding process. And also the B cells themselves are being duplicated. The cloning process is amplified. So you have a very amplification process. So there are much more of those B cells and the antibodies for the next time the same antibody will come again. So swarm, I explained to you, this is kind of thing we do in, this is, for instance, robots here, they cannot pass over the gap except if they connect each other, then they can pass over the gap. So the idea is to have a robot, this thing we do in the lab, to try to understand how the robot can call their partners, This is very complicated and I don't want to get into too much detail, but this is kind of engineering we do in the lab, and this is all done by simulation first to do in the real robot, because we don't want our real robots to die. Because we don't have problem with our simulated robot today. This is a good problem of playing with robot and genetic algorithms or optimization process, because natural selection on real robots is very costly. But on simulation, it's very cheap. And one other thing I was doing with Raphael, in fact, and this is the reason why Raphael tends to be here, and this is the reason why I interact with him. Another thing that we are doing in the lab is to build computer simulation to try to understand complex reaction networks, chemical reaction networks. This is things that I used to do with chemists, and then Raphael came, and we worked together and to try to, build one other thing that, I don't know if you like that. I think in Sweden you're much better at programming than we are in Belgium. I'm telling that because complex system programming, a system where you have a lot of actors, for instance, a lot of molecules, a lot of reactions, or in biology, when you simulate ecosystem with a lot of different animals. So, imagine the immune system. In the immune system, people knows a little bit like, there's something like thousands of different type of cells, so B lymphocyte, T lymphocyte, macrophage, etc. If you want to simulate that, you cannot do that in Fortran, or it's a question of adopting a good practice of simulation. And what I'm teaching is, in fact, that good practice. Computer scientists know the good practice, which is, for instance, object orientation, UML, etc. But I don't know if it's the case here in Sweden, but natural scientists, physicists, biologists, chemists, they don't know anything about object orientation. So what I'm doing, since I'm teaching chemists and biologists how to do good programming, I'm using their culture, their science. In fact, I'm here, that was an exercise I did. I did the simulator myself. It was a chemical reaction simulator. I wanted to replicate in software the Miller experiment, famous Miller experiment. I like to be able one day to do it in, Miller did it. Miller was fascinating because he did it in a tube test. I wanted to do it in the software, and find exactly. Can you imagine how complex it is? But it should be possible. It should be possible. This is why I called Raphael to my help. But Raphael came with another problem that was interesting at the time, which is the origin of homochirality. And then this is Raphael's thing. So I hope you know it, because this is a very interesting thing that it came out by interacting among themselves. So I don't want. Okay. So as being an engineer, and I want to conclude then the first half of the talk. As being an engineer, 20 years ago, when you wanted to do engineering by use of computer science, one very popular field was artificial intelligence. This is where I come from, and this is the typical achievement of artificial intelligence. This is Kasparov being defeated by Deep Blue, the famous computer software. And artificial intelligence was very much inspired by the cognitive side of human being, thinking side of human being. So thinking is sequential, deliberative, planning, conscious. This is artificial intelligence. Theorem solving, game playing. Typically that type of game. Expert system. You might remember this famous terms back to the 80s. That was artificial intelligence. When you this is inspired by cognitive science, but when you're being inspired by biology, then come another form of intelligence. Can we still call it intelligence? I don't know, but people call it, for instance, artificial life. And then what you're trying to build is engineering tools which are parallel, adaptive. Learning becomes a very key aspect. You have like a neural network. Neural network is typically that kind of engineering tool. So you have learning machines which are parallel machines. So for instance, that was the great success of computational intelligence back to the 80s, Kasparov. This is the great success of computational intelligence these days. You remember that neural network was able to drive without driver a car in the motorway. Every year now there is a famous competition in the United States, which is that competition. These are cars without drivers. This is a competition that has taken place 2 years ago, and the winner is obviously the winner of the competition. And the purpose of a competition is to have cars, circulating. In that case, it was in the desert, something like 100 kilometers per hour, 80 kilometers per hour. Constant speed in the desert for 5-6 hours, okay? And you should see the kind of ways where they go through. Sometimes you have really like mountains with very narrow road, and they have to go through desert with water, whatever, very complicated. It can rain or not. Any kind of climatic conditions, and this car has to leave from a certain, departure point, and alone has to come back, and the first to come back. And I can tell you that on 100 cars, there are only 20 that just arrived. The other one that just lost, right? And the first one is a winner. And in fact, if you see how the first one won, it was, I know the guy who did that car 2 years ago. There was a lot of new AI, so a lot of learning, a lot of neural network, a lot of kind of unconsciousness. And if you think about you when you drive, you do much more unconscious thing than you do consciously. You're not really thinking when you drive. You do a lot of parallel, adaptive, very automatic things. And this is exactly how our computers should drive cars today.
Are there collisions between cars and
No, there's no collision. They didn't occur, but there could be, but there's a lot. I think, I don't know exactly how the condition racing are so that there is no collisions. In theory, there could be collisions. I think that one of the first things they are capable of these cars is obstacle avoidance. I think this is the first thing that at least the gun-based system. But just to give you another example, one of my favorite ones, chess has been defeated by a very classical AI type of game approach, computer approach, where it's deliberative. I don't know if you know the min-max algorithm, which is one of the classical algorithms for playing chess, at least for computer. And you build, a tree, where the player one do that, then the player two can do that, and player one can do that, and you build a tree, and you try to figure out what is the best strategy in this tree. And this is purely classical AI, sequential deliberative conscious. If you try to apply that to other games like the backgammon or the Go, you know what is the most resisting game today for AI is Go. Go will nowhere. If you want to achieve something interesting in AI, is to build a very strong Go player. But at least the best we have, both in the backgammon and the Go, is by neural network, learning. Just, playing by learning, learning by playing, No trying to build the expert rules. Have a neural net, for instance, have a computer playing against himself, and just learning, learning by playing. This is the best player we know it. And we don't know how he plays. But he learned to play, by playing against himself. So just to give you an example of the strength of learning in these new things. Okay, second part, which is networks. So I want to sit with your physicist, and as I told you, there is a new kind of resurgence of interest in network. Varela, in fact, studied network back to the 80s, and he was interested in the immune network for the reason that I mentioned, but also in neural network. And I worked with him at the time, and we were also interested in immune network and neural network, and we didn't know that network would become so popular just 20 years later. So what's a network? The reason why it makes network so popular is that the definition of network is very simple. It's graph. So everyone knows what is graph, nodes and links. Okay. But so what is the difference between graph and networks? A network is a graph plus a certain dynamics. So graphs are changing in time. So there's two ways of changing in time. The nodes can, for instance, if you take, suppose that you have a social network and you suppose that the node are human being and the state of the node are they welfare, how good they are, or when they are. So that can change in time. You can be better in the afternoon than in the morning, whatever. So this is the first change in time of the network. And the second thing is that the network itself, the structure of the network can change in time. You can add new nodes, some nodes can leave the network, some links can appear, some links can disappear, you can reinforce the strength of the link, that is different change in the network. And you see, network is a very universal thing. You have networks in chemistry. In fact, this is what what I like to carry on doing with Raphael. This is, a chemical reaction network, famous one called the glycolysis, very complex one. In those chemical networks, the nodes are obviously molecules, and the edges are the reactions. Social networks, very popular these days also with Facebook, and those things that, our kids, I don't know if you have kids, some of you should have kids, and how crazy they are with Facebook. But Facebook per se is an interesting thing because people are studying the kind of networks emerging out of Facebook. Computer networks, the web, obviously, or internet, neural networks, they all have nodes, they all have edges, and they all have dynamics. Other networks that are being studied these days, protein networks, in that case, protein are node. In fact, what is the edge is the binding. Exactly the same binding that you have in immunology. When two protein binds, you can build an edge between two proteins, And the color of a protein is the degree of ugliness, So this is also, there is an aesthetic flavor in networks, so people are drawing those networks a lot. This is the web. And in the web, a connection, it's simple, it's an hyperlink. When you click on a web page to reach to another page, this is an edge, and this is all this web are being studied. Actors network, what you should bother about actors network. What does that mean, an actors network? When two actors play the same movie, there is an edge between two actors. As simple as that. Now I'll tell you why people study that. But the crazy networks are in industry today. Routing networks, obviously, when you have a route connecting two cities, etc. So, One of the things that people lose when they study network is, in fact, what kind of network is that? And I want to distinguish three kinds of network. What I call the individualistic network, the global network, and the afunctional network. I think one important criteria when you study network is to understand what is this network for. And at least you should differentiate individualistic network and global network. What I call an individualistic network is that any node cares for itself. Any node has, it's like in a PC network, you want every computer to work as best as possible. You don't really care about the global network, except if you use internet for executing one program. That people are doing that with grid computing. Then the network becomes global because the whole network becomes interesting. But individualistic network is different than global network. When you use global network, then the network should satisfy globally an outside user, like distributed computing or biological networks are always global. You remember my definition of emergence? Global networks, biological networks, they are emergent because there is a user that makes sense of these global networks. So this is the first difference that you should keep in mind. People are studying some properties of this network. So what kind of property? The first property, the most famous one, and in fact this is why I made famous this physicist that I was telling at the beginning of the talk, Barabasi. The most famous one is the topology. People realized, in the year 2000, people realized that the topology of a network, social networks, computer networks, biological networks, whatever kind of network you can imagine, every network, people realized that the topology was not random. A random topology, this is typical of a random topology, this is a Gaussian distribution, and in fact, the number of neighbors, the nodes you're connected with, is nearly the same depending on the nodes. Every node, nearly every node has the same number of neighbors. Okay, you get me? This is a random network. There is no privilege nodes. In theory, they just all connect the same way. Okay, this is random network. And in fact, random network has been a lot studied by mathematicians and by physicists. One of the very famous mathematicians who studied random network is Ernst, who was a famous mathematician. Random network was one of his favorite type of subject, and he did a lot of thousands of papers on this random network. But people realized that Barabasi, certainly the most famous one these days, he realized that network was not random. They could be clustered. Okay, clustered means that there are regions of more highly connected networks. But what makes him very famous is that it could be scale-free. And scale-free is a very simple idea. Scale-free means that now the distribution of a degree with respect to the node is no more a Gaussian, is a scale-free curve, is a power law. Okay, that 1 on x square something, or x the power something, in general 2 is 1 at... so, I mean, the number of connections is inversely related with the nodes, with the number of nodes. So you have a lot of nodes, we are poorly connected, and very few nodes, okay, which are largely connected. Okay, this is what you see here. Okay, you have a lot of nodes with very few connections, and you have very few nodes with a large number of connections. That was a great discovery of this Barabasi. And he realized that in the web, he realized that in social networks, he realized that in biology, he realized that in any kind of network you could imagine, he found that scale-free property. Well, it's interesting, for instance, if you look at, this is, a routing network this is a motorway network in the United States, which is in fact random, this one of the few network which is random. And this is the airplane network, which is very scale-free, because in fact, if you look at the airport, and if you plot the number of airports with respect to the number of connections, we can, the other number of airports they can connect to, then you have a scale-free network. You have very few hubs, a much more very small airport. In the United States, you can imagine JFK, Dallas, and whatever are the hubs of the airport network. Just to give you the difference between random network and scale-free network. This is a log-log plot. So this is power law plot in a log-log thing, so you have a straight line. Okay. And in fact, what Barabasi realized is that he studied different networks. The web, this was the first network that he studied, by the way, the web. That was the first, the web. Internet, which is different network. Internet and the web is not the same thing. Internet is just the physical connection among computers. The web is the hyperlink connection among computers. The actor network, the actor network, just two actors playing the same movie, so this is an edge. citation index, okay, simple one. Sex web, that was a very, surprising, where they found the biggest hub. This is just the number of sexual relations you had, and the biggest hub, the most important hub, got something like 3,000 sexual relations. When I read those numbers, you should read the numbers. It's pretty surprising. You can imagine 3,000 different, and that was an homosexual network. It seemed that very much more frequent relation. In fact, they studied that because they wanted. This is not just for fun, because they wanted to understand the propagation. You'll see that this is one of the reasons why people are studying those networks. They want to understand the propagation of epidemic. So the hub is obviously playing a key role in the propagation of epidemic. So it's interesting to spot the hub in a network.
So there is no universal power law here.
Here it's a universal power law. They all follow that same law. The only thing that changes is this gamma. But not, this gamma remain very, very similar. That was surprising, for physicists, because this gamma just, it's in between 2 and 3. In all those experimental networks that they studied. That made Barabasi famous, and you can understand, physicists are all in quest of universal law. So, he found a universal, to some extent, he found a universal, law in
What exactly is K?
So K is, so if you remember here, so this is the number of nodes, and this is the degrees. Okay? So you have, K is the degrees, so you have the number of law, so this is the probability of having K connections. Okay, you get me?
And so the curves that you showed, which went over 2 orders of magnitude, is that an actual example? And
this is an example.
And it applies to what?
This is the...
That one, yeah.
That one.
Because that's remarkable. I mean, remarkably straight.
Oh, yeah. But they are remarkably straight. which is really, I'll explain you why. In fact, some are more remarkably straight than others. In general, in human type of networks, so routine network, web network, internet networks, even social networks, they are remarkably straight. In biological networks, chemical networks, the kind of study we've done, this is not so obvious. We have kind of that oscillation between the random network, have somewhere compromising between random network and so often you have also that kind of network, which is not a straight arm. So this is the actor network. People study that. They even study what are the hubs, just for fun, if you're interested in American cinema. So this is the hub of the actor networks in Hollywood, only Hollywood. So the hubest is Rob Steiger, and you see that just what that means, nothing except that Rob Steiger played in a lot of movies with a lot of different partners. That's just that. And Erdos network was studied. In fact, Erdos network has become very famous because you might know that all mathematicians today they carry on their visit card the number of Erdos, which is if you publish with Erdos, you're number 1, so you're Erdos 1. If you publish with someone who published with Erdos, you're Erdos 2. If you publish with, I don't know if you know your number, but this has become, all the mathematicians I know, they put them in the visit card. You can see even in the website, if you go to visit the website of a mathematician, you always put no, his Erdos number seems to be more important than anything else, to be even having a small one, not a big one. If you have the 7, you don't show it. But the mathematicians have studied that, and you can difficultly, it's hard to be more than 5, for reasons that can be easily explained. So obviously it's better to be 2 or 1 than 5, but okay. So and this was a paper I wrote with Varela in '91, just to tell you that we were kind of anticipatory. This was a network we studied it was an idiotypic network we studied in mouse. And Varela and myself, and we realized that in idiotypic network, the network was not at all clustered randomly. It has a strong structure, and I'll show you what kind of structure it has. So why is that interesting, this topology? Well, it's obvious that the topology could in fact, in theory, could impact the function of the network. One of the first effects is what is called the small world effect. People try to explain, how in big networks, nodes can be very close to each other. So what is the distance between 2 nodes? It's just the smallest number of nodes you have to cross in order to connect 2 nodes. Just 2 nodes randomly, and you compute the number of nodes that you have to cross, the minimal number of nodes that you have to cross to just connect two nodes. This is called the distance. And normally, in random network, the distance is very small, because you always find path to connect to, anyone, okay? In regular networks, suppose you connect with your closest, physically, your friend is very close to you, okay? And so you just connect, then the distance will be very long. So if you want to reach someone in the United States or even further, someone in Australia, and if you just connect with your geographical neighbor, you will need, thousands of nodes in order to connect your friend in Australia, okay? And you might remember the famous experiment of Milgram. Milgram was this psychologist who made an experiment back to the 60s, and he showed experimentally that we all related by 6 degrees of partners. In 6 degrees you can connect to each other in the world. That was surprising at the time. How can you connect to 6? And there was different type of explanation. Yeah.
How are these random networks realized in practice?
Random network, you form a node and then you just connect them randomly.
This happens in practice.
You mean in practice? How a random network can happen in practice? Not at all, because in fact you never get random networks in practice. There was a few mathematical idealization. In fact, in practice you have scale-free networks.
But the highway
seems to be more. They are very rare. Random networks are very rare. In fact, the highway, in general, networks are generally scale-free. Some of them are not completely random, and one of the reasons why they have some kind of randomness. I'm going to describe that later on. They're not completely random in the sense of a Gaussian, but they have a certain distribution that make them, I'll show you. This is, in general, networks are either scale-free or this kind of distribution, and that can explain. This distribution can be explained when you grow the network and any new node comes, whenever a new node comes, it connects randomly with the existing node. Then you have this type of distribution, which is not a random network would be one where you already have the nodes, okay, and you connect randomly the partners. But that, in practice, doesn't make a lot of sense. While this one is more possible, whenever a new node comes, it connects randomly to the existing node. So first thing is the small world. In fact, what Barabasi explained is that the small world effect is due to the hubs. What makes a node very small, what makes a node very restricted on itself, is the presence of hubs. Because hubs is just a shortcut. Whenever you want to connect two nodes, you just have to go through the hubs, and then you can connect very easily the node. So the theoretical explanation of the smallness, of the little size of the network, is due to the hubs. That was explained by those physicists. The other thing that is interesting in those networks is the robustness of the network. A random network is not very robust, while a scale-free network is much more robust for not. There's an important issue here for not targeted attack, and you can easily guess why. If you attack the hub, obviously you destroy the network. But since you have much less hub, but you have kind of indifferent nodes, you have much more indifferent nodes than hubs, then when you target those nodes, when you make a random attack, you're not supposed to attack the hub because you don't have a lot of hubs. You would attack a very simple node. And then those scale-free networks, they are small and robust in theory. So this is what can make them functionally interesting. So then another thing that those physicists did, and that was interesting, is they explained the scale-freeness. So now I'm going to answer your question. Why are they scale-free? And that was the hypothesis, and it seems that it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense in human networks. It doesn't make a lot of sense in biological networks. In fact, I propose another theory for biological networks, but in human networks it makes a lot of sense. The theory that explains the scale-freeness in human networks is preferential attachment, which makes a lot of sense. What is preferential attachment? The rich get richer. Whenever a node appears in the network, it will not connect randomly. It will connect to the highest connected nodes. When you bring a friend to a network, generally the guy who brings the friend to the network is already a hub. The hub is more likely to bring a new friend than a non-hub. If you come with a new computer in a network, suppose the web, you will certainly connect to Google, or you make a connection to a hub. So a hub is much more likely to get new nodes than a non-hub. And if you simulate those two rules, the growing rules, new node come in, and the preferential attachment rules, a new node will preferentially attach to already connected nodes, then you get scale free. It can be shown theoretically, not a lot of maths, but you can be shown that it's scale free. And that is the explanation that people give. So this is for topology. But this is not the end of the story. There is also an interesting aspect when you study, above all when you study chemical networks and you study biological networks, there is an interesting aspect which is the dynamics. Nodes are changing in time. In fact, this is what we are also interested in my lab, studying the dynamic of nodes. And in general, you can have fixed point dynamics, you can have oscillatory dynamics, you can have chaotic dynamics. The three kinds of dynamics that we know. And in fact, we study all kinds of dynamics for different purposes. With Raphael, in chemistry, in general, this is the kind of dynamics. You have fixed point dynamics, but you can have interesting bifurcation, or in fact, the homochirality is an interesting fixed point dynamics, but with a breaking symmetry. You go all left or all right. This is Raphael's work. In ecosystem, you much typically the network, the ecosystem network, like the famous prey-predator network that has been studied by Locke and Volterra back to the 60s. The typical dynamic is oscillatory. The prey and the predator are just oscillating in time. And this is the kind of dynamic that seems to prevail in the brain. Our brain seems to be more chaotic than oscillatory. By the way, just an experimental, very surprising things. When your brain becomes oscillatory instead of chaotic, be careful. This is becoming of a, for instance, epileptic crisis, this is fascinating. When they put electrode and they can really see what happens in the brain when there's an epileptic crisis, you could imagine that in epilepsy you would be accompanied by chaos. When you look in the brain, you see large wave of oscillation. It's like the brain becomes completely synchronized. And all nodes of the brain, and that is typical of epilepsy. The brain becomes to oscillate, and not at all become chaotic. And in fact, with viral also back to the 80s and 90s, we were studying different patients. That was the concentration. This was minute. And that was the concentration of the antibodies in time. We could follow the concentration of the antibodies. And we were trying to show in the 80s that perhaps some patients with autoimmune disease, this is one of the diseases that no one really understands. Autoimmune disease, which are a very fatal one. When you get some of those diseases, it's a dramatic situation. And we wanted to show that people with autoimmune disease has concentration of antibodies, which the fluctuation in time was different. We didn't have a lot of points in time, but we, that was what we were trying to do in those networks. Other thing that people are studying, the dynamic of network, is the epidemic propagation. So this is a very simple dynamic because the node is infected or not. Okay, so the dynamic is quite simple. The node can be only binary, but you have a wave of propagation. People are studying, obviously, epidemic propagation. You can imagine that this is a very important field of study. And what has been shown is that in scale-free networks, again, this is a typical scale-free networks, whatever, what has been shown is that epidemic will propagate much more faster in scale-free network than they propagate in random network, for instance. And one of the reasons is hubs. But no, the hub is playing a bad role, because the hubs are propagating epidemic in a much faster way. In fact, people have studied the propagation of epidemic of the AIDS in the United States, in California. And it's funny because if you try to understand how fast the AIDS are propagated, in 2 years, remember the number of infections was incredible. The best way to explain that is the scale-freeness hypothesis. Because if you suppose that the sexual network is a random network, which is not, because they've shown that the sexual network is scale-free. If you suppose that the sexual network is random, even with a huge degree of partners, not 3,000 like the hub I was telling, but even with, 50, 60, 70, knowing the probability of propagation, when you make sex with someone else, you have a certain probability of getting the virus, knowing that the AIDS should never have been propagated. The only, today, the most acceptable explanation for the propagation of the epidemic is the scale-freeness. Because of the hubs, and like the guy who had 3,000 of partners, because of the hubs, the AIDS could propagate it so fast. So you see people are, and by the way, the mathematicians, when they studied epidemic back to the 80s and 90s, they was always assuming a random network. The random network was a very classical assumption because to some extent, this is the simplest one or the most natural one, but it seems to be the most universal one, while it's not at all. Another thing that we're doing in my lab This is a funny story, and I just tell you the story because this is, you might know, and this is nearly the end, so don't worry. I'm covering, as I told you, I'm covering different things, and but we can. I'm open to discussion if you want to focus something more. One of the things that really interests people in my lab are to, when they simulating network, is to understand how cooperation emerges in the world. I've seen that Sweden is a very cooperative country. It's well known for being much more cooperative than Italy. I'm from Italy myself, where people are much more defectors than cooperators. But independently of that, it's interesting to see how cooperation emerges in a world where defection should be the rule. You remember the selfish gene of Richard Dawkins? We should be all defectors. Why are we cooperators? And we should even be more defectors due to the prisoner dilemma, famous experiment. This is, John van Neumann and Nash thing, where you have two partners. You know that matrix, that game theory matrix, is the famous prisoner dilemma. When you both cooperate, you get 1-1. This is the payoff you get when you both cooperate, okay? When one cooperates and the other one does not cooperate but defect, the guy who defect receives a very high payoff. Okay, you get 3, and the guy who cooperated has been defected. He's been betrayed. The guy gets -2. It's a symmetrical matrix. Okay, and they both defected. They get -1. The Nash equilibrium, normal thing to do, obviously, for each partner is to defect. All right, because when you defect, this is where you get the highest gain. So both partners will defect. Okay, you give me money, I don't give you back. Okay, but since I know that, no one will give money to anyone. So they both defect. And if they both defect, this is a very bad solution. But this is the Nash equilibrium. This is the normal, the rational choice. We should be defective according to that game matrix. It has been a very real shock in the economical world and the social world. Why aren't we all defectors? And there's been a lot of explanation. One explanation is tit for tat, that famous computer scientists has done back to the 80s, showing that when you have reciprocity, you won't defect, because if you defect with someone, the possibility that the guy has to defect against you will prevent you from defecting. So if you have reciprocity, you'll be cool. Okay, that was one possibility. The other possibility, which is more interesting here, is when you put that on space and you make the behavior being able to evolve. So typically, you put that in space, and you have the agent here that can be defector or cooperator, black or white. Okay, and they interact with their neighbors. Okay. And what they do, they play the game theory, they compute the payoff, all right? And what they do, they just imitate their neighbors. So if they have a neighbor which is doing better than them, they just play the same thing. So if a defector in your neighborhood is doing better than cooperating, you will defect, okay? So you try to imitate the one in your neighborhood, And if you play that game, you realize that cooperator can survive if they form cooperation, if they do cluster. Cooperator can survive in cluster. So the best way to survive cooperation is to be with cooperators. It's a trivial thing, but you can show that in computer simulation. What is the connection with networks? We did the same on networks. And a random network, you all have defectors. Everyone will defect in a random network. You play the same game in a random network. So what you do is you play the matrix game with your partners, and you compute, you just imitate the best of your partners. But the more hubs, the more heterogeneity you have in the network, the more you're likely to cooperate. So just by changing the topology, that was interesting to me, because just by changing the topology, not changing the number of partners, but just changing the topology of your network, putting it more heterogeneous than homogeneous, then cooperator will naturally evolve. And since the society is much more scale-free than random, okay, so the hub is the explanation of cooperation. So you have another interesting story here with this topology of a network. Okay, but the very complex thing is, to make them both interact, to see how dynamics and structural evolution can. And that makes it very complex because, in fact, you have a key interdependency. This data dynamics, this structural evolution, the networks evolve in time, and by evolving in time, you change the dynamics of the node. And the dynamics of the node change, and it changes also the network. So you have a very complex interdependency. And this is exactly what you have in chemistry. So I'm going to skip that. This is exactly what you have in chemistry. If you study chemical reactor, you have those two levels because new molecules come. In fact, if you think about the Miller experiment, this is exactly what happened. You have a set of molecules. You remember initially Miller put 4 or 5 molecules. What was methane, oxygen, or I don't know, 5 molecules, and not oxygen or hydrogen. In fact, not oxygen because oxygen wouldn't make that. Hydrogen.
Ammonia.
And he had 5 foes, and at the end he had I don't know, 1,000 of molecules. And in fact, it was amino acid that makes this experiment famous. But if you try to simulate that, you have both things to take into account. You have the appearance of new molecules, and also perhaps the disappearance of new molecules, and also the concentration of the molecule changing in time. So you both have the kinetics in time and the coming in and coming out of molecules. And that, that makes same thing with immunology. In immunology, you have a refreshing rate, an incredible refreshing rate. In fact, the second prize of immunology, there has been 2 Nobel Prizes in immunology. One is Neil Jian, the one I was telling you. Another one is Tamakawa, Japanese, who realized that our immune system is being refreshed at a very high rate, like 90% of new cells being refreshed every day. And in fact, this is random generation of new cells. In fact, this is Darwin put during life, because you have completely random generation of new B lymphocytes, new antibodies coming randomly, and some of them are useful. They just react to virus and antigens, but some just disappear because they're not useful at all. So you have this high refreshing rate, and so in order to understand immunology, you have to understand this structural change and also the change in concentration of the nodes that are already there. Neural network is the same thing. It's a very complex network where the activation of the node is changing in time. But the network itself is changing in time. Even if you think about, for a long time, people thought that in the brain, the only thing that was changing is the synaptic weight. That was the legend. That the brain was the only organ where you didn't have renewal of neuron. When you're born, you seem to have, and the only thing that was changing is the strength of the synapses. In fact, learning was. This is the reason why neural network just put the learning in the synapse. The strength of the connection. People realize that it's not so rad, and that you have a new neurons, new glial cell, like they call it. You have a sort of refreshing of even the brain cells can be renewed. But anyway, you again have this very complex dynamics with change of the structure and change of the connection, and also the nodes are being activated in time. In fact, we're studying, this is things we're doing with Paris. We have some partners in Paris where we're studying the oscillation in the brain of, in fact, this is just a funny story because this is a Tibetan monk. They seem to have very strange oscillation pattern in their brain when they do meditate. It seems that meditation is a very special experience for them. And you can see that in the brain. People are studying the brain when they are really in this complete, Zen things, and if you look at the brain, you have strange waves activation in the brain, just to show them. Okay, conclusions. So what are the main applications of networks in natural science and engineering? So natural sciences, I think network has become a very key field, and one of the reasons is that it provides the scientists with new lenses for understanding and mastering complex systems. For instance, this story that disease can be characterized by the dynamics of the nodes. This is really new. You try to understand, you follow the nodes in time, and you can characterize the disease. Other things is the importance of hubs. So there is a completely new understanding of epidemic today due to the hubs. Because these hubs play a key role. Not only viral epidemiology, this is the one of disease, but viral marketing. The marketing thing has been changed also. You're not economists, I guess, but even in economy, these hubs networks has had an important impact in the way you market. People are realizing that if you want to make an advertising campaign, it's better to take your phone and call a hub than call anyone else, because in order to diffuse a message, it's better to reach the hub as the first guy to be reached. So in the kind of epidemiology, it's better to get rid with the hub, to put the hub in quarantine. While in case of marketing, it's very good to target the hub. Hub also is a key feature for robustness. If you want to understand the robustness of network, you have to understand the hub. And you have people, mainly we were discussing that in the United States, studying the metabolic network and trying to find the hub of those metabolic networks. So for instance, there is a famous protein that has become famous in metabolic and in biochemistry, which is the P53, which is a protein which is well known to be a hub. It connects with everyone else, and it seems that it plays a key role in cancer. At least if you target that one, people can inhibit. No biologists have ways to knocking out gene. They can just knock out gene and make gene not expressed. And it seems that there is promise of therapy by targeting more some nodes than others. So they have a genetic network and they target some hubs. Small world is important. Small world effect. Think about Google. Google is searching the web. It's better to find the shortest path in the web. So it's better to know the topology of the web. So people in Google, for instance, they're studying the topology of the web because the whole, if you think about the whole algorithm of Google, they need to know in order to make that algorithm run faster, they need to know the topology of the web. And they study the topology of the web because you remember that in Google, a node is important when it is connected with other important nodes. Okay, and the importance of a node is the degree of the node. So everything that I told you is very useful also for Google running. In engineering, as I told you, there is a new kind of engineering which is popping up, more out of control. This is it seems surprising, but to accept for an engineer an out of control engineering. But what I call out of control is that you leave the system run by itself. It's so complex, okay, that it's hard to wire it. It's hard to tune it in a kind of optimal way. So you leave the system find by itself how to behave in the best way. So this is a very new vein of engineering which is becoming very famous in neural networks, swarm intelligence. We're building control networks and sensor networks. This is kind of thing we're doing in our lab, also distributed traffic control, etc., etc. Okay, I think it's better to stop here. I think I give you a general figure, and it was very shallow. I didn't want to make it heavy. A lot of little things, like kind of Japanese food, a lot of sushi. And but please, if you want to know more about any kind of topics, just feel free to ask a question. And thanks for your attention. Yeah, please.
I'm interested in this cooperation and defection.
Yeah.
Okay. History, in some sense, you can think of as memory or imagined memory.
Imagine?
Memory.
Memory, yeah.
So is some notion of memory built into these networks?
Now you have a notion of memory in one of the games which is called the repeated prisoner dilemma. Because in the repeated prisoner dilemma you have reciprocity. So what happened in that case is that any agent remember what the agent interacted with before did. And in fact, there's a famous computer tournament that has been organized in the 80s by a guy called Axelrod, who wrote a fantastic book called The Emergence of Cooperation. Because he said, okay, once you give memory to the agent, so the agent can memorize what happened when he interacted with someone, and what was the behavior of this someone. So he will adapt his behavior, so he will, the next time you meet that guy, he knew what happened and so. And so they made a game, and the funny story is that he invited people on the web, and he proposed to those people to invent the rules by taking into account the memory. So, what happened before by interacting with the agent. And anyone was supposed to give a rule. For instance, one rule could be, I always defect. Whatever you did in the past, next time I see you, I defect. Okay? Could be, I always cooperate. Whatever you did. Could be, if you defect 3 times in the past before, I would defect, or some kind of very complex rules. And the winner was tit for tat. And tit for tat was this very simple rule. I first cooperate. Okay? I first cooperate. But whenever you do something, I do the same. So I cooperate with you. But if you defect, I defect. Okay? And if you cooperate, I cooperate. And this has become a very famous rule, because in fact this is the kind of rule we follow. But by having this rule, you still cooperate. There was a bad message and a good message. The good message was that you begin always by cooperating. Okay, so it's better to first always cooperate. But once you defect, you're not very forgiveness. You defect also. But memory is playing a key role there.
So how was the coupling done in the clustering model? Is this just a
which one?
Exact copying? I mean, you had this where you said that scale-free networks have a tendency to cluster and then can avoid the prisoner's, yeah, that one, the prisoner's dilemma.
So
how
this was not a network, and this was a, so keep it differently. I've been very fast on that one. What happened is that on a prisoner dilemma, normally defection should win, except if you do memory and iteration, or another possibility for cooperation to emerge is to put things on space. Okay, so no, you put that in a grid,
yes,
and any agent play with his neighbors.
Right.
Okay, so in that case, what would happen is that a clustering, in fact, emerge, and what's happening is that the yellow guy are cooperators. So the cooperators tend to protect themselves by being surrounded by cooperators. Just that, you know. In fact, if you are surrounded by cooperators, you know, the payoff will be higher. So this is, so for some values of the parameters, but a large amount of value, this is the kind of stable, you know, stable situation you have. So cooperators, because it's the only way for cooperators to survive is to regroup themselves. It's enough. Normally, you can explain that very simply by even it doesn't need to be as big as that, but in a very simple, you could compute the payoff taken by all those guys, but you see that if they have more cooperators surrounded, if you need to have a threshold, you know, you need to have enough cooperators around surrounding you just to survive. And but now you speak about scale free. And one of the problems that that Barabasi found in his network, and this is why we did some of experiment that I mentioned but I didn't describe, is that in Barabasi's hypothesis with this preferential attachment, you have scale free, but you don't have clustering. And this is very strange because in a lot of networks you have scale freeness and you have clustering. By clustering I mean that the density of connection is not homogeneous. You have a lot of small clusters. In fact, biological networks are very particular for that. They have a high degree of clustering. Okay? They are scale-free, but they have a high degree of clustering. And in general, you can measure. In general, in network, people measure two things. They measure the degree distribution. You know, this is random. This is scale-free. And they also measure the degree of clustering. And how they do measure the degree of clustering is a very simple thing. They compute, for instance, if they have 3 nodes, okay, so they do look at how cluster they have, so how they do that. I should have a slide for showing that. But they look how much. Let me remember again. How do they do it? They look at the number of triangles, the number of triangles that exist in the network, divided by the number of potential network that the number of potential triangles that you can build. So, for instance, if you have 4 nodes, okay, so you have all the possible triangles that you can build in the 4 nodes, and they compute the number of real triangles that you have in the network divided by the number of potential triangles, something like that. And so doing that, they compute a certain clustering measure. And the more cluster you have, this is the curve you should have for clustering network. And in fact, both random networks are very few. They're not clustered, but even the preferential attachment, they're not clustered. And so we propose another type of biological networks, which I simulated and I wrote on some papers. Because one of the problems with Barabasi model is he made assumptions that are not very meaningful in biology. One of the assumptions he made is that all the nodes are the same, which is not true. All the nodes are not the same. You have proteins, for instance, that by definition, by birth, they're much more hub-like than others. You know, some molecules are much more hub-like. So that was the first assumption that we discarded. And another assumption that when a node can connect on the basis of the preferential attachment. That makes a lot of sense in human network because you could find the hubs, but how can you imagine this as a natural laws? You know, how could suppose a new protein come in a network calculate the degree of the existing protein and decided to connect on the basis of this computation. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So we decided to provide another rule, which is just whenever we get a new node in the network will connect to the most active node, or the most concentrated node, something like that. Not computing the degree, which was impossible. So we made some simulation with that. So for instance, this is the kind of simulation we made. In the beginning, a small number of nodes with concentration 1. At each time step, a new random node is proposed and enter the network if it's connected with an existing node. And so we compute the affinity between two nodes. The test is based on an affinity criterion. So a network has affinity with another. A node has affinity with another node. You compute the affinity. If a new node has affinity, it will connect to the network, etc. So we do that kind of modeling. And if you do that kind of modeling, this is our model. Oh, excuse me. This is what our model gave. We had preferential attachment. We had scale freeness, but we had also good clustering. Mm-hmm. So our model is much closer to real biology than Barabasi model. So I believe that Barabasi explained very well the web, explained very well some social networks, Facebook perhaps, but Barabasi doesn't explain quite well the chemical network and the biological network. And we would like, since I was interested in trying to understand what is the topology of biological networks, we modified a little bit the model. We made the preferential attachment different, less likely than just preferential attachment, and we finally get a result that seems to be closer, more faithful to biology than what Barabasi had.
Okay. Thanks very much. That was
okay.